Have you ever wondered why we buy so much stuff on the internet and why everybody seems to buy everything with a credit card these days? All that really starts in the 1920s. That's really what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Today we're going to talk about a thing called consumer culture. Specifically, we're going to talk about the rise of consumer culture. We're going to try our best to answer the question, how did the booming economy of the 1920s lead to changes in Americans' lives? The short answer is it really deals with money. Grab your pencil and paper and get ready to take some notes, because here we go. So in our last video, we talked about Henry Ford and how he used things like scientific management and the automated assembly line and paying his workers a fair wage and not working them half to death. So what do all these people do now that we have cheaper products and people actually have some money in their pockets? Well, it's this thing called the consumer revolution. So as more and more companies decide to take Ford's approach and use automated assembly lines and scientific management and paying their workers a decent wage, people start to see a whole lot of new affordable goods start to become available to just about anybody. You also have cheap electricity thanks to Edison and Westinghouse that's now kind of in play. And people need things to be able to use all this. Well, you also start to see this huge drive in advertisement. Advertisement that's driven by a relatively new science called psychology. You start to see ads kind of like we have today that have the "you need this because" attitude about them. Here's a prime example of that kind of advertising from the 1920s. This is from Listerine. Take a look at this ad and ask yourself, what's really being said in here without using actual words? The ad itself starts out by saying, "How's your breath today?" If you look a little closer and you start to read into the advertisement, the next statement is, "If it's bad, you won't be welcome. Use Listerine." The psychology behind this particular ad is pretty simple. It's saying, if you have bad breath, the lady's not going to want to kiss you. If you use Listerine, you'll have good breath. And if you have good breath, she's going to want to get close and there's probably going to be some making out that happens. Another thing that really drove this consumer boom in the 1920s was this new idea called installment buying. Sometimes it's referred to as buying on credit. With this increase in consumer credit, people started borrowing to buy things instead of having to save up to buy them, pay for it in one lump sum. Along with credit, we have this idea called the installment plan. Buy now, pay later. The saying in the 1920s was you could get just about anything you wanted for $1 down and $1 a day. In the 1920s, about 75% of radios, 60% of cars wind up being bought this way, with installments. Does that sound a little bit familiar? Think about today. Think about how people buy things today. It's pretty rare that we save up and pay cash for something. Typically, we take out a loan, we pay a little bit at a time, even if it's on something as simple as a credit card. And this idea of consumer credit or buying on installments was something that was very, very public, even in advertising of the day. Take a look here. You could get your own Harley Davidson for only $2.50 down, and then you could pay on the new Easy Club plan. Or how about this vacuum cleaner? $2 down, $3 a month. You could have this fancy thing to keep your house nice and clean. Along with this crazy new consumer culture that starts to develop in the 1920s, you also start to see a real boom in the stock market. As companies start to kind of ramp up and produce all these goods that people are buying on installments, you start to see what's called a bull market. A bull market means that the stocks are all going up. Sometimes you may also hear the term a bear market. You don't want a bear market. That means stock prices are falling.
But pretty consistently throughout the 1920s, the stock market in America saw a bull market. Stocks were on the rise. A lot of Americans, especially these Americans that are getting better paychecks, they start to realize, hey, I can invest in this stock market and I can get rich pretty quick. A lot of them used pretty risky methods to do this. They did what's called buying on margin. It's essentially the installment buying for stocks, or buying stocks on credit. We'll talk a little bit more about what buying on margin is when we start to talk about the actual stock market at the end of the 1920s. Spoiler alert, things don't go very well. But a lot of Americans, a lot of average Americans, start to get involved in the stock market. And this actually drives that boom. The more people that get involved, the higher the stock prices go. Things are going awesome in the 1920s for a lot of average Americans. One thing that doesn't really get talked about very much in the 1920s, though, is the not so booming economy. There are a lot of aspects of the American economy during the 20s that don't go over so well. The first thing being that wealth is still really poorly distributed. If you're living in a city or one of these new developing suburban areas, you're doing all right. You get to take part in this economic boom and you see some money in your pockets. If you're living out in some of the rural areas, if say you're a farmer, things aren't going very well for you at all. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Another aspect of the economy that really wasn't booming all that well, especially at the beginning of the 1920s, was that industrial wages were still really slow to rise. So think about the factory workers versus the management. If you were management, things were going great for you. But if you were a factory worker, it took a while before you started to see some extra money in your pockets. A lot of this had to do with the Great War. As soldiers returned from Europe, they started looking for jobs. Unfortunately, there weren't a lot of jobs for those soldiers to find because those jobs had already been taken up for the war effort. In order for a worker to keep their job, they kind of had to do without some stuff like a decent paycheck. When you have an excessive number of people looking for jobs, it's kind of hard to demand a high paycheck because whoever's in charge is probably just going to say, hey, it's no problem. I'm just going to fire you and hire this guy over here that'll actually work for whatever I'm willing to offer. The last major thing that we need to talk about when it comes to the not so booming economy was farms. Farm income was on a huge decline. During the 1920s, farmers have to rack up huge amounts of debts trying to feed the cities. You remember that big cycle we talked about when we talked about the little farmer versus the bonanza farmer? And as the little farmer was trying to compete, they had to go into debt to buy more land to produce more crops, which actually caused the price of the crop to go down. This really starts to show in the 1920s. As fewer and fewer farmers are available to try to make food for the cities, crop prices just absolutely plummet. And this will eventually come around to seriously bite America in the butt at the end of the 1920s.
So what should we take away from all of this? Well, number one is the consumer revolution. It's really all about affordable goods marketed to us using psychology-driven tactics. Number two, don't forget about installment buying. You could get anything you wanted as long as you had $1 down and could pay $1 a day. Number three, remember that the economy of the 1920s really wasn't booming for everyone. There really was a poor distribution of wealth, wages were really slow to rise, and there was a massive decline in farm income. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you got some great notes out of that and you have a good answer to our question. Be ready for that quiz when it happens in class. And as always, till next time, remember, don't stop learning.